morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this, the first in our series of webinars on working from where. I'm Helen Marsh. I'm a partner in the Forsters residential property team, and I'm joined today by Henry Cecil, an expert in rural property conveyancing, who's joining us live from the countryside. He's going to tell us about some of the special issues in countryside property. We've got Vicky DeCrow, who's head of our planning team, and Joe Beeston, who's an employment lawyer, who will talk about some of the employment issues about working from home. We've certainly seen an increase in our clients moving to the countryside. We've heard about it anecdotally, and we know that the large agencies are reporting this trend as well. Just last week, Rightmove published some statistics saying that searches in rural locations at villages and small towns have doubled since the lockdown and all of this began. And the Savills stats report something very similar as well. There's a combination of factors causing it, the obvious one being that people have been working at home, and it looks like for a lot of people that trend is going to be a permanent shift. Even if they're not doing it full time, there's certainly going to be less time spent in the office, so therefore less time commuting. And of course, if you had less space in lockdown, you certainly suffered more. And people don't want that again. So if they possibly can, they're looking for more space in a garden. And then, of course, if they're working at home, they need more space for an office as well. So there's a need for an extra room, if nothing else. Another thing that's fueling this move is these reduced SDLT rates until the end of March. So we've certainly seen those combination of factors resulting in a surge in interest in this kind of move. So we're going to talk about some of the legal issues today affecting you or your clients, anyone you're advising in this potential move to the countryside. If you do want to ask any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and if we have time, we'll answer some at the end, and we'll get through as many as we can, and if not, we'll follow up on them later. So, first things first, Joe, a worker, so an employee is working from home at the moment. How do they know if they can continue to do so? And is there anything else that they should be thinking about before they launch into their move to the countryside?
Yes, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. And yes, I think in short, Helen, there are some things we need to think about from an employment law perspective. And I think it's first worth thinking about sort of what it is your employment contract says, which is the core document that governs your employment, as to where you're meant to be working. I should imagine the majority of people will have a contract that says you're expected to be in the office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Now, as you rightly pointed out, many people are currently working from home, but that's as a result of government guidance or in most cases, some form of informal arrangement. And whilst the impression we have is that a full return to the office seems unlikely, especially anytime soon, I think what we have learnt is nothing is certain in life. And I've already had a few clients, employer clients, who have expressed some concern to me around a full transition to working from home, noting that team culture has started to be lost. Some of the logistical issues around dodgy internet connectivity, which whilst excused at the beginning, is now becoming a bit irritating. Creativity is not as high as some people are saying. And so one of the concerns I think we might just want to be aware of is what happens if we do find a vaccine and some employers actually turn around and say, hang on a minute, we want people back in the office full time, relying on the employment contract for asking employees to come back. Now, that would be problematic if you or one of your clients has bought their dream house in the country on the assumption they're only going to be doing the dreaded commute to London once or twice a week. So I think it's important to think about that point. It is important, and having that dialogue with the employer, understanding what the future plans are, and ideally agreeing some form of permanent change, i.e. some form of permanent working from home arrangement, will be key to make sure plans later down the line don't scupper your dream home. And I think it's also worthwhile, if people are moving to a more permanent home-based working arrangement, just taking a step back and understanding what rules and policies they are subject to. Now, most people have found themselves working from home, as a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, not really fully appreciating what this may mean. But I should imagine most people will have policies and procedures they're not even aware of, which deal with how they should work from home in terms of keeping data secure, how they should be disposing of confidential waste and so on. And so it is worthwhile understanding whether any of those exist and make sure you comply with them to make sure you don't inadvertently end up being in breach and getting yourself into trouble. And I think finally, from my perspective, one small point which is worth checking is household insurance. Now, most or many household insurance policies do allow people to work from home, especially in clerical and desk-based jobs. But if it's going to be a permanent shift and you're working from home more than you're not, it is worth checking your insurance policy to make sure you're covered. So I think for me, Helen, it's making sure that you've got that sort of contractual protection and that you can change your working arrangements on a more permanent basis, and understanding what it means to you as an employee in terms of any sort of policies and so on, which may apply.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm just going to go and check my home insurance policy now. Henry, so our imaginary person's found their dream home to live and work in. They've owned property in London before, but never in the countryside. So what extra things should they be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I'm very pleased to join you, Helen, from my field of straw bales, which looks quite appealing on the screen. Yeah, there are a number. Obviously, buying property in the countryside, buying rural property, there are a number of nuances that perhaps are different from buying in London or in the town, for example. And there's a whole host that we could cover. But just a handful, for example. So agricultural tenancies, which are always very key to look out for when you are buying some land, whether it be a paddock or whether it be 10 acres or 100 acres. It's always very important to look closely at how that land is occupied and how it is used, and for how long has it been occupied by the person occupying it. So we will want to know, is it being farmed for the purposes of agriculture? And if it is, when did that person go into occupation? Was it before in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, or before the 1st of September 1995? And the key for that, behind that, is that that'll help us decide whether it might be an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy or a farm business tenancy, if it's a tenancy as opposed to some form of other grazing license. I think Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies are more onerous for the landlord, more beneficial for the tenant. They were introduced in 1976 and granted succession tenancies, potential succession tenancies to the tenant for up to 3 generations, and they still very much exist. But they can depress the value of the land by up to 50%. And it's very difficult to get the tenant out, the very limited break provisions. And the rent is obviously suppressed as well. So we're wary of that, and they can affect not just land, but maybe just a building which could be used for the purposes of agriculture. If the occupation was post the 1st of September 1995 and the tenant went in after that, then if it is a tenancy of some sort of an agricultural tenancy, it'll likely be, well, it will be a farm business tenancy, which is a better kind of tenancy from a landlord's perspective. It's more akin to freedom of contract between the parties. There's a more minimal security of tenure. You can generally get the tenant out after 12 months once the original term has elapsed. And you can include break clauses, whether it be a year's break clause. If the tenancy is for 2 years or less, then you can include any break clause, maybe 2 or 3 months. So tenancies are something that you really do need to look carefully at, no matter how large or small the area of land that you are buying. And then, of course, there are other ways in which land, I mentioned, it could be under a grazing license. And again, you need to look carefully, whilst it might say grazing license, you need to look carefully to see whether, in fact, that tenant might have been grazing it since pre-1995. So you do need to sort of dig a little and find out a bit more about the history of it. In no particular order, other elements which are sort of relevant when you're buying a property in the countryside. Well, not great for this time in the morning, but sewage treatment works and septic tanks. I don't know if anyone knows the difference between a septic tank and a cesspit. A cesspit, basically, it all stays in the cesspit and you have to empty it out fairly regularly as it fills up. A septic tank generally has 2 chambers, and all the sludge, if you call it that, stays in one chamber, and the water drains away and soaks away. Now, it's very important, government rules or rules have changed recently, and from the 1st of January this year, you need to make sure that you're not discharging dirty water, soak away direct into a watercourse. So you need to ensure that you have a good working sewage treatment plant, which complies with all regulations, and it hopefully should ensure then you don't breach the rules. And of course, you need to look carefully at this, because putting in place a new sewage treatment plant on a country property can be, I don't know, £15,000. And that's regularly sort of a sum that is sort of banded about when you're negotiating a contract, and this comes to light. Other elements, although chance of repair liability. Now, since October 2013, some people might have thought that this has sort of fallen away because the church needed to have registered the liability prior to then. However, it's still a potential banana skin for you. I mean, it all dates back to Henry VIII times when he disbanded the monasteries, and the rector at the time was responsible for the repair of the chancel, which is the area of the part of the church where the choir sit and where the altar is, the east end of the church in that sense. But when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and the land was sold, the repair liability itself passed with the land, and it continues to do so. It's a perpetual liability. Now, since 2013, it can still apply and attach to land if the land has not been sold for value, or indeed if it's unregistered. So we're always very wary when we're looking to buy a property to see whether there is any possible liability. You carry out your chancel search, and then you can take out insurance. It's not that expensive, but there have been tales of liability in the church successfully getting sort of £250,000 from homeowners. So you need to, not something you want on your watch. Last one, just, I mean, there are many other things, overage. Often in the countryside, particularly now when development is rife, and they're always talking about easing planning rules. I know Vicky's going to talk a little bit more about those. But often sellers will think, well, I've got a 10-acre field there. It's adjoining a highway. You know what, I might try and hopefully it might get development, and I'd like a little bit of that pie, please. So a seller will insist on an overage agreement, which will basically give them a right to a percentage of the development value, the uplifted development value, should a planning permission ever be obtained, say within 40, 50 years. And they might agree, I don't know, a 30, 40% overage. That would be the payment that we due to the seller. Obviously, it's a neat way of trying to reserve and preserve some development value to the seller when they've moved away. However, from a professional point of view, they do take quite a bit of drafting, and it's very important the terms are very clearly and succinctly detailed by the agents when they get to the lawyers, because more often than not, a deal can turn sour just because there's a dispute over the overage provisions because they perhaps weren't properly thought out at the start, and maybe it's not the prime reason for the sale. So just a few elements there, Helen.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating stuff. Vicky, moving on to planning. Do you need planning permission to work at home?
Well, I'm afraid with a lot of planning matters, it is a grey area, and it's very much a matter of fact and degree and case specific. So it'll vary from, for example, just working in a bedroom in your home, probably fine, to suddenly doing some big office development, conversion and things where you probably do need planning permission. So if we take some sort of likely examples, in terms of sort of what you might be looking at. So say the starting point is normally just converting one of your spare rooms into use of an office. That's probably fine. Another example could be utilising existing outbuildings. Again, probably a cheaper way of utilising what you've already got. So there you're looking at, has there been a change of use that might require planning permission? So change of use from residential to an office. You don't need planning permission where there has been a change of use if that second use is ancillary to the first use. And you don't need planning permission for the change of use where you're talking about use of land or buildings within the residential curtilage that are for any purpose incidental to the use of as a dwelling. So looking at ancillaries to start off with, if you're using one room in your house, that's probably absolutely fine. If you're looking to convert the entirety of your ground floor, that's probably more of an issue. Some other factors to consider are whether your new home office will share the same entrance as the rest of the house. Again, that means it's probably more likely to be ancillary. If, however, actually you decide to, it's got its own separate access point, you're going to have clients and visitors coming purely for the purposes of visiting that home office, then that may need planning permission. You may have facilitated change of use there. Looking at utilising existing outbuildings there, as I say, you can rely on this prevent a sort of general exclusion that says you don't need planning permission where you can use it doesn't affect the enjoyment of the dwelling, but that's limited to within the residential curtilage. And again, it's a matter of fact and degree, and on that basis the courts haven't been able to give us a clear definition as to what curtilage in the residential context means. Some courts have defined it very tightly, so it could just include the immediate buildings and your sort of courtyard garden. Others have actually said it could be wider. So if you're looking to use an existing shed or whatever and convert that that's very close to your main building, that may be fine. If you're looking to convert a barn in a paddock some way away from the main house, that may be more, may need planning permission, may not be able to rely on this general exemption. So that's looking at utilising sort of existing buildings, and that's probably your cheapest way of having a home office.
And what about if you don't have the space already, or you want to be as far away as possible from your family?
If you don't have this, an obvious idea of extension property, and rather what we committed to the right means you need planning permission. You still send information to local authority.
Can I just interrupt you there? Your connection's got a bit rubbish, so do you want to turn off your camera and then we can hear you?
I apologise. Is that
It's not great, actually. Shall we move on and then we hopefully come back to you if your connection gets better? Do you want to let me know?
Sorry.
Well, who's next? Who are we picking on next? I'm trying to remember. I think we're back to Joe. Any other complications that, or any other employment issues to think about? What about if the house is a very grand one that comes with a gardener or a housekeeper or even a butler?
Yes, we often come across the rogue butler and gardener. Yeah, I mean, there are some employment issues that arise, especially with larger rural properties or sort of small country estates. And as you say, Helen, quite often the seller will employ staff, typically gardeners, groundsmen, and so on. And there can be a debate as to what happens to those staff on the transaction. Now, typically, if a buyer is buying a property that's purely domestic, a pure residential property, then unless the buyer wants to take those staff on, normally those staff are made redundant by the seller, and so when you acquire the property, there's no staff in situ. However, the position can be trickier where there can be said to be some form of business activity, and that's a really loose definition, that's somehow attached to the property. So for example, let's say the property had a holiday cottage that it let out during the summer months, and the gardener was also responsible for looking after the garden of the holiday cottage. There may be an argument to say that that employee is somehow attached to that business which will be acquired by the buyer, and therefore the dreaded TUPE rules apply. And just for the benefit of the audience, that the TUPE rules basically say where a business is sold, any employees that are attached to that business automatically transfer to the buyer along with any sort of liabilities and obligations and so on. So there are examples, and there's no case law on this. So sometimes it's a bit of a commercial debate to be had where the seller says, no, look, actually these staff become yours purely by virtue of these regulations. And so I'm sorry, buyer, but you've now got a groundsman and a gardener. So it is a point which can be forgotten about until lawyers get involved. So I would stress it's one of those points where there should be some discussion initially, and it's really important to understand whether there are staff on site and what the commercial intention is. That will enable us as lawyers to draft and achieve the best outcome, because it's important the sale agreement contains certain protections and clauses depending on which route is taken. But it may be the case the buyer wants to keep those staff on. It could be that they want a gardener. Often groundsmen and estate managers know the property inside out, and actually it can be a real valuable asset to take that person on. Or it may be a buyer has their own staff they want to employ. And in both of those situations, it's really important to make sure the employees have sort of proper contracts in place, and the buyer, as the employer, now does all that it needs to. And there are certain things, certain obligations on new employers to set up payroll, to have proper pension arrangements in place, and so on. So there are third parties that can help buyers with that. But again, it's just worth thinking about if you are looking at hiring staff, to make sure all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And that's something that we at Forsters often help our clients with. So I think that they're the key issues, Helen, in relation to staff.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Joe. The good news is we've got Vicky back, I think. So
yes, my apologies for that. I don't know quite what happened with our internet in semi-rural Oxfordshire.
I think we lost you just at the point where I was asking you what to do if you wanted to be far away from your family.
Right, yes. So an obvious point, if you don't have enough room in your current house to convert one of the rooms to a home office, would be to build an extension. And there are various permitted development rights, which means you don't need planning permission for extensions. Now, it's very fact specific. It depends on the size of the extension. It depends on the size of the property, whether there have been any other extensions, proximity to a road, for example. It could impact on whether you're in an area of outstanding natural beauty, as I appear to be in today, or in a conservation area. All those are factors that will determine whether or not you can rely on these permitted development rights. It doesn't mean you can just go off and merrily do your works. You do still have to notify the local planning authority and show them the plans to get a very informal sign-off from them. And that's very important that you have a clear paper trail if you are looking to rely on these permitted development rights. So when you come to sell your property, you can hand over all that information to the purchase solicitor to show you were able to rely on permitted development rights. So that's an important sort of internal housekeeping step that's really worthwhile doing. If you decide actually you really hate your family that much and lockdown's been hideous and you want to escape from them completely, then there are obviously a growing trend to utilise these home office pods within gardens, or you might actually decide to build a sort of more permanent structure. With these home office pods, there is a question mark around whether they need planning permission. Whether or not you need planning permission depends on whether there are three factors that have been determined by case law as being important. One is permanence. And then one is the extent to which it's fixed to the ground, and the final one is sort of size. So a small home office pod, probably okay on the size test. Quite often they are fixed to the ground, foundations and everything else, and you want to run services into it as well. So chances are you will need planning permission. Again, it's worthwhile having a chat with the local planning authority just to see if they agree with you. If they say actually you don't need planning permission, again, keep that correspondence from them just so you can got that clear evidence basis when you come to sell the property. There are the shepherd's huts that you can sort of wheel around your garden for a lovely view depending on your mood and what part of the garden you want to work in. They may still require planning permission. Just because you can move them and they're not fixed doesn't mean to say that they can't require planning permission. There was a case with a marquee in a hotel grounds where the marquee was up for 8 months in every year, but that was held to be sufficiently a degree of permanence to it that planning permission was required. So it's always worthwhile checking with the local planning authority whether you need permission. And again, as I say, it's very fact specific.
Thank you very much. Anything to say in particular about listed buildings?
Yeah, you'll always need planning permission. Well, you need planning permission for works that materially affect the external appearance of the building, i.e. you don't need it for the internal works. However, if your property is listed, you may need planning listed building consent for any works you do internally. So for example, if you want to take down an internal wall to make your office space bigger, you are likely to need listed building consent. The test for whether you need listed building consent is very subjective, and it does depend on sort of the reason why the property was listed in the first place. For example, if the reason the property was listed is due to the stunning exterior, the local planning authority may be less concerned about works you do internally, and they may be more relaxed about whether or not you list a building consent. If, however, the property was listed because of some amazing internal staircase, then any works that might affect that staircase are likely to need listed building consent. It is very much specific to the local authority and down to the very heritage officers what route they take. Some authorities will say, no, we want to sign off on all internal works regardless of whether they affect the reason the property was listed. Others authorities say a bit more relaxed. What we always try to do is work very closely with heritage consultants who know that local authority, who know the officers and know the approach those officers are going to take. It is important because if you don't get the necessary listed building consent, then there are criminal sanctions that can apply to that, and you can be required to make good the unlawful works that you did, and there may be a Proceeds of Crime Act fine as well that goes along with it. So it can be very costly and obviously very onerous if criminal sanctions do apply. If you do acquire a listed property, we always recommend our clients to take an inventory of the works that have been carried out. So whilst if you didn't carry out the works yourself, won't face criminal liability, you can still be required to make good any works the previous owner has unlawfully done. So again, it can be quite costly. But that's why ensuring you have a good paper trail is important to show the works have been properly carried out with the necessary listed building consents. Yeah. But also, you may then
just avoid prison. You still potentially have to take on the cost of remedying something that was done.
Exactly. So it's one to be wary of.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vicky. Well recovered. Right now, Henry, are there any other things that our hypothetical buyers should be thinking about? For example, maybe a good broadband connection.
Well, let's put ourselves into Vicky's shoes. She's in the country there. She's got the most beautiful background scenery, and she realises she's doing a Zoom webinar, and her internet's a bit dodgy, and which causes a bit of concern. So she thinks, right, I need to lay a new internet cable. I need to get fast fibre broadband. So she goes to her deed. She calls up her lawyer. And her lawyer looks in the transfer for her property. Her property was perhaps part of a larger estate. It was sold off 30, 40 years ago. And hopefully her lawyer will be able to confirm that the transfer contains the appropriate rights to obviously get cables, telecommunications laid through the adjoining property, which is still retained by the estate which sold the property 30, 40 years ago, and she can go on and she can dig a nice trench and connect to the local telephone exchange. However, it may well be that a lawyer can't do that and says, I'm very sorry, Vicky, but you don't have a right to go on next door and dig a trench and lay a cable. So Vicky then has to go to the neighbouring landowner and ask for a specific deed of easement so that she can lay a fast fibre cable. So again, when we're looking at all these documents, all these transfers, particularly with properties in the countryside, whether they're part of an estate now and they're being sold off, or whether they were sold off a number of years ago and we need to check the rights now, that's what we're thinking about. Can we have unfettered access to services, whether it be internet, whether it be phone, water, gas, electrics, and the use, for example, with the electrics, are you okay with just the existing electricity supply, or do you need three-phase? Will you have the ability to go onto the adjoining land to upgrade the supply, particularly if we're all going to be working from home and using up more electricity? The same applies for access. So obviously we always like to check, well, we do check that you've got an access direct from the public highway. Sometimes an access may be over third-party land, but again, we need to ensure you've got all the correct rights of way documented. If not, and if you're buying off an estate for the first time, those are clearly laid out with the correct repair and maintenance proportions there. So yes, I think we've had a good example of sort of the need to have reliable services.
We have. Thanks very much, Henry. Changing tax a bit, tax is always a big issue on any property transaction. And of course, the main one is stamp duty land tax, which is always complicated. It becomes more complicated every time there's a budget or a finance act. But specifically related to the countryside, there are a few issues or reliefs to look out for that I'm just going to run through quickly now. Of course, if it's your second property, if you're keeping your city, your London place or your town place and buying an additional property, of course, you're stung by the additional 3%, which can bring the rates up to an enormous 15% over and above 1.5 million. If you are replacing, though, your main dwelling, but you still have a second property, but you're replacing your main house, then you don't need to pay that extra 3%. So make sure that whoever is buying is carefully advised on whether or not this extra charge applies. And then also don't miss out on some good reliefs while they're still available. Multiple dwellings relief, which means if you buy 2 or more residential properties in the same transaction or same linked transaction, you get to average out the prices of those 2 and then pay tax at those rates, which can often be lower. So if you're buying a main house which has a small cottage attached to it, or even just a granny annex, if it's self-contained, then you can benefit from multiple dwellings relief, which you need to do the sums on it because it's not always beneficial. But if you get the maths done, you might find that actually you save quite a lot on stamp duty. And then the real the jackpot is if you can claim mixed use relief, where if you buy residential property jointly with some commercial property, so here we're thinking of agricultural use, which counts as commercial property, the whole transaction is taxed at the commercial rate rather than the residential rate, which brings the rates down enormously because the top rate for commercial property is only 5%. So if there is any land with the property, it's worth looking into whether or not you can demonstrate that has agricultural use to get that big savings on stamp duty. So when advising clients on their move, tax has got to be one of the big considerations. Henry, let us know what other tax considerations are there, and then are there any specific to rural property?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure many people are aware of agricultural property relief and business property relief. So ordinarily, subject to satisfying various conditions, certain conditions, if you own farmland, if you own agricultural property, a farm which is used for agriculture, you will qualify, or you should qualify, for agricultural property relief, which is an inheritance tax relief, which I suppose exempts the value for that particular agricultural property from your estate for inheritance tax. So let's go back to my field, which I own 10-acre field, which is say worth £1 million or something. I don't know. Sorry, 100-acre field worth £1 million. That is the agricultural value. If I were to there'd be an inheritance tax event, either I'd go under the proverbial bus or want to gift it. That value would be free of inheritance tax, so there shouldn't be a 40% charge on that value. In agricultural property relief, obviously it attaches to agricultural property. There are the conditions for satisfying it. If you farm it yourself, you're driving the tractor yourself, or indeed you get a contract farmer driving it for you, and you've owned and occupied it for at least 2 years, then you should qualify for the relief after 2 years of ownership. If, however, you've only owned it and you don't occupy it yourself, you might let it to an agricultural tenant on a farm business tenancy, then you will only get the relief after 7 years of ownership. And another slight nuance is that if that tenant is there under an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, then if that predates September 1995, then and it's not a succession since after that, then you'll only get 50% relief on the value. So you need to look very carefully at what type of tenancy it is, and how long you've owned and occupied the land for. But that'll relieve the agricultural value. Now you can land, my 10 acres will also potentially have some development value, which will be a lot more than the agricultural value. And if I want to try and ensure that that passes free of inheritance tax, then I'd be looking at business property relief. And I would try and get that by obviously farming the land myself. Again, might be under a contract farm arrangement with another farmer who would come in and I'm the farmer, they would come and do the work, or a share farming agreement. And if I can do that, and I'm trading, and I'm the one carrying out the business, I'm the one retaining the risk, then I can hopefully get business property relief, which would then hopefully shield the full value for inheritance tax. So it's a very valuable relief. This is all up in the air at the moment because they have carried out a big IHT review, and I think we're all expecting some form of change, particularly after what we're all going through at the moment. So it may well be that if we come back in 6 months' time or a year's time, we'll all be completely different.
Yeah, we'll have to keep updating on that. So the question arises, what effect is this mini exodus having on the London market? We've seen certainly people selling their London properties to move out. We've also seen people remortgaging those properties, keeping them, remortgaging them and renting them out. And indeed replacing them with smaller London properties to use as a small pied-à-terre for the times that they are in the town, and so to fund the purchase in the countryside. Certainly the house market is thriving. There's lots of competition for good houses with some garden space, and because mortgages are harder and slower to get, cash buyers are certainly even more at an advantage than they normally are. In the summer, we would normally expect that to be a quiet time for residential property, but it stayed busy throughout and was unusually busy. And so really our big learning point from all of this, as I suppose as everyone's, is that we should expect the unexpected and that we can't possibly predict what's going to happen next. There's an awful lot to think about, as we've shown with the move to the countryside, and given all the different aspects and different potential complications, a buyer really does need a holistic review of the whole thing, rather than just focusing on what houses look nice. They have to consider the planning, the employment, the tax, and as well as all the property issues. So we hope we've given you a bit of a flavour of that, and we're happy to help. We've got time for a few questions now. There's one relating to planning, Vicky, and then some tax questions. I'm going to start with the planning one.
Sure.
Vicky, I'm thinking of buying a property with a large barn. Will I get planning permission to convert it into an office?
Right. Well, we sort of covered off utilising for your own home office. If we're talking about bigger offices here, then I think we're going to see an increasing demand for the sort of the classic sort of rural business centres and things where you can rent an office or help rent and then share the use of the meeting rooms and other facilities. I think, as you say, people looking to move further away, not go into the office so much, but may want to have that separation between home and work life. And so actually these rural sort of office developments, I think, are going to become increasingly popular. Whether or not you'll get planning permission will depend on your relevant local planning authorities' planning policies. Planning applications have to be determined in accordance with those policies. And so there may be policies there that relate to the promotion of rural businesses and enterprises, in which case you could rely on that policy. You need to look at any counter policies. So, for example, the loss of agricultural facilities or agricultural land may be a sort of counter that would mark against you in terms of likelihood of getting planning permission. One thing to bear in mind, if the use of the barn is probably going to be okay, looking at other factors. So, for example, if you were to build on one of these lovely fields behind me in what arguably looks like an area of outstanding natural beauty, the visual impact of the barn being converted might be a key consideration for the council. Not just the barn itself in terms of putting in windows and doors and everything else, but also the car park. So think carefully about how you might be able to visually screen that car park. And then it's all about the access to that barn and to the car park, and whether you've got enough visibility display around the access off the highway, and whether the local country lanes can cope with the volume of traffic that you're anticipating. We're not talking large scale developments, but even an increase of 3, 4, 5 cars on the road, an already overstretched road, can be too problematic for a local authority and could lead to quite a lot of concern from local residents. So it's definitely one to have a good planning consultant on board who knows the local authority, and someone, if you're looking to do a substantial barn conversion, a series of barns and things, or stable blocks, then possibly getting a sort of a PR consultant on board. We're seeing them used increasingly, and they're very good at engaging with the local community and reassuring locals in terms of the planning process and what's being proposed.
Thank you very much. Nicely linked, actually, we've had some other questions about what the effect on capital gains tax, and specifically, I'm going to get to PPR, principal private residence relief, there would be from converting into a home office or converting on a larger scale. I think none of us here would claim to be tax experts. So I will defer that one to another webinar when our tax team will be on. But I can certainly say that yes, it has potential to affect that PPR. If it's as we always say, it's a question of fact and degree, and how much the conversion has altered the main use of the property. So a small home office, probably not. A large, impressive new building with perhaps other people using it and it being a commercial endeavour, it probably will. Henry?
Well, I was going to say, I think it also comes down to, let's say you've got a room which you use exclusively for your business and you don't use it for any private use at all, then I think you will potentially lose a potential value on your PPR for that office. But however, if you continue to use that room for private use, so it, maybe during the week you might work in there, and maybe in the evenings it becomes, you can demonstrate it actually it's just another room in the house which you use, and I think there's potential then to preserve the exemption. But I think it's something I prefer our tax colleagues to opine on. But I think it's a fine line.
Well, thanks everyone. I say let's finish on time. But if there are any more questions, please do email. I see I haven't had time to get to all of them, but please do email us separately and we'll come back on anything else. And thank you very much for joining us.